It was June 12, 1873. Farmers in southwestern Minnesota saw what they thought was a snowstorm approaching their fields. But before long, they could hear beating wings, and they saw that what had at first seemed to be snowflakes were in fact clouds of grasshoppers. In a matter of hours, knee-high fields of grass and wheat had been eaten to the ground by the hungry hoppers. And the grasshoppers' dramatic descent was only the beginning. For more than 4 years, 1873 to 1877, those grasshoppers destroyed wheat, oat, corn, barley, and anything else they could get their hungry mouths on in Minnesota and surrounding estates. In 1876 alone, just in that 1 year, the grasshopper plague affected 40 counties in Minnesota, completely destroying more than 500,000 acres of crops. These grasshoppers, or what scientists call Rocky Mountain locusts, were not new to Minnesota, but in the past, they had stayed for a year or two. But in 1873, when they moved in from Dakota Territory and Iowa, they laid their eggs deep in the soil and worsened their plague from year to year. 1874 was worse than 1873, and each year they continued to spread. The farmers in Minnesota were creative, hardworking folk, and they tried to do a number of things to get rid of the grasshoppers. They beat them with flails, they dragged heavy ropes through their fields, they plowed and burned their fields. They raised birds and chickens to eat the grasshoppers. They dug ditches that they hoped the grasshoppers would not be able to jump over. They filled the ditches with coal tar and set them on fire, thinking that the smoke might drive the hoppers away if the ditches did not. In later years, they made grasshopper dozers or hopper dozers, which consisted of sheet metal covered in coal tar or molasses. They would drag the hopper dozers through the fields, gathering whatever stuck to them, and then pile the grasshoppers into piles and then burn them. As you can imagine, none of these efforts were particularly successful. Finally, a new governor was elected in 1876, John Pillsbury, the same John Pillsbury that Pillsbury flour is named after. He proclaimed April 26, 1877, a statewide day of prayer and fasting. Governor Pillsbury was recognizing that there was nothing man could do to stop this plague. So he urged every man, woman, and child to ask God to prevent this terrible scourge. So on April 26, 1877, schools, shops, stores, and offices were closed. There was a reverent, quiet hush over all the state. The next day, April 27, dawned bright and clear. Temperatures soared to what they ordinarily would have been in midsummer. It was unseasonably warm and very unusual for April. But the people were devastated because what the heat did was bring out billions of grasshopper larvae. They were hatching out everywhere, and this warm heat continued for 2 more days. For 3 days, the Minnesotans were devastated. They thought, this is horrible. Our prayers have not been answered. What's going to happen? But the next day, the weather shifted. There was a cold snap. There was frost over almost the entire state. A weather front moved in, bringing snow, sleet, and unseasonably cold weather. And the majority of those grasshopper larvae died. This reinvigorated people, gave them new courage, and they re-attacked the grasshoppers. And by the end of that summer, the few remaining swarms actually flew out of the state, ending the plague. Many, including me, would attribute the end of that grasshopper plague to divine intervention. For you see, man came to understand that man without God was no match for grasshoppers. Let's keep that in mind. We're going to come back to that at the end. Man without God was no match for grasshoppers. We're going to continue in our study of the book of Numbers. Pastor Aaron authorized me to continue with the study, and so we're going to turn to Numbers 13, and I would invite all of you to open your Bibles with me. We're going to work through this. and see a chapter here that talks about grasshoppers and see how we can apply these principles to our lives today. Numbers 13, we'll start in verse 1. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Send thou men, that they may search the land of Canaan, which I give unto the children of Israel. Of every tribe of their fathers shall ye send a man, every one a ruler among them. God already knew that the land that he had brought the children of Israel to was a good land. He just wanted to give them an opportunity to trust him. And so he was going to send them in to see what it was that he was about to give them. If we jump down to verse 17, we'll see the job description that was specifically given to them. Before verse 17, the 12 men are selected, one from each tribe. And in verse 17, Moses sent them to spy out the land of Canaan and said unto them, Get you up this way southward and go up into the mountain and see the land, what it is, and the people that dwelleth therein, whether they be strong or weak, few or many, and what the land is that they dwell in, whether it be good or bad, and what cities they be that they dwell in, whether in tents or in strongholds, and what the land is, whether it be fat or lean, whether there be wood therein or not, and be ye of good courage, and bring of the fruit of the land. Now the time was the time of the first ripe grapes. So if you look at the job description of these 12 spies who were being sent into the land of Canaan, first of all, they were to find out, is the land good or is it bad? What are the people like? Are they strong? Are they weak? Are they few or are they many? Are the cities walled or are they fortified? Is the soil fertile or poor? Is it wooded or cleared? And oh, by the way, bring back some souvenirs. Bring back some fruit of the land. It was the time for the harvest, the time that the grapes were ready. And Moses, who I'm sure, like many of the Israelites, had been eating manna 24/7, was saying, we'd like to see what else is available in this promised land. I want to point out, though, something in verse 20, right in the middle. I don't know if you caught this as we went by it. In the middle of verse 20, he says, And be ye of good courage. Did you see that when we went by there? He's telling them what to do, what to look for, what to inspect, and by the way, be of good courage. What does courage mean? According to Webster, courage is mental or moral strength to venture, persevere, and withstand danger, fear, or difficulty. It doesn't mean that you're not going to experience fear. It doesn't mean you're not going to experience difficulty. It doesn't mean that you're not going to experience danger. What it's saying is, in spite of all these things, you will persevere and you'll proceed anyway. And so Moses cautioned the spies right up front, you're going to probably see danger, fear, and difficulty, but I want you to persevere and move forward anyway. In verse 21, we see that it says, So they went up and searched the land from the wilderness of Zin unto Rehob, as men came to Hamath. Now, how long did these men wander? We all know this story to some degree. How long did they go out on this exploration? 40 days. Do you know how far they traveled in that 40 days? How far is it from Zin unto Rehob? Zin, the wilderness of Zin, was the southernmost point of this land of Canaan that they were coming to, and Rehob was the northernmost point. And if you look at the distance there, it's approximately 250 miles. Now, since they were in there on an exploration mission, I doubt they were making a straight line approach, so they were probably doing some meandering and taking the longer scenic route at times. But if we look at the round trip in these 40 days, it would have been at least 500 miles that they were traveling, exploring this land, following the job description that Moses had given to them, that God had given to Moses. So it says, so they went up. They searched the land. They went through it. They saw the people. And then in verse 23, they came unto the brook of Eshcol and cut down from thence a branch of one cluster of grapes, and they bare it between two upon a staff. And they brought of the pomegranates and of the figs. The word Eshcol just means a cluster of grapes. This area was actually named based upon this huge cluster of grapes. I've been in cars, I've been in Fred Meyer's, I've been to some fruit stands in the lower 48. I've never seen a cluster of grapes that required two men to carry it. And I'm sure to these people, seeing this ultimately must have been impressive. It definitely was a land of milk and honey. It was something that God had promised and something that they could see was very good. Well, in verse 25, it says they returned from searching of the land after 40 days. These men had been enjoying this bountiful harvest. They had been seeing the good things of the land for 40 days. They had been seeing some of the difficulties as well. They had seen some of the people, they had seen the fortified cities, but you think that after experiencing these good things for 40 days, it would have made a distinct impression. Verse 26 says, they went and came to Moses and to Aaron and to all the congregation of the children of Israel unto the wilderness of Paran to Kadesh, and brought back word unto them and unto all the congregation, and showed them the fruit of the land. Reminds me of kind of a show and tell. They brought word and they brought fruit. They told them about it and they showed them. You know, it's one thing to tell people something. They may believe you if they have some degree of trust, but when you can show it to them, that's going to further reinforce the credibility of what you're telling them. And that's exactly what they did here. They brought back, here's some of the good. Look at what we found in this land. Verse 27, and they told him and said, we came unto the land whither thou sentest us, and surely it floweth with milk and honey, and this is the fruit of it. They were reaffirming that this land that God had told them would be theirs was a good land. It flowed with milk and honey, and by the way, here is some of it. Here's some of the fruit that we brought back. But look at verse 28. That first word, nevertheless. What's another word that we can use for nevertheless? But. Now remember, sheep follow, but goats but. This was a situation where they were presenting all the good. They were talking about the good of the land. And it wasn't enough for them to leave it at that. But, they said, nevertheless, the people be strong that dwell in the land, and the cities are walled and very great. And moreover, we saw the children of Anak there. Now, the children of Anak were men of large stature. They would be called giants in our terminology. And the Israelites were afraid of these guys. So they said, these people they're powerful. They've got walled cities and giants. If it's not enough that they're powerful and have walled cities, they have giants to spare. We'll see that Caleb responded differently. In verse 30, Caleb stilled the people before Moses and said, let us go up at once and possess it, for we are well able to overcome it. This was a situation where we had some spies who were trusting in God, who were willing to follow his commands, who were willing to accept his promises at face value, who were willing to exercise their faith. And they saw things going badly and said, wait a second, let me still the people, let's get this going back in a better direction. Caleb was trying to do that. It was effectively, he saw a board meeting going in a bad direction and was trying to make a motion to get it going back in the right direction. He said, come on, guys, we are well able to do this. If you look at the NIV, it says, we can certainly do it. This was a word of affirmation, a word that's positive. And if we look at... there's a couple of quotes. There's a quote here by Robert Stevenson. It says, keep your fears to yourself. Share your courage with others. Ellen White has a similar phrase. She says, when tempted with unbelief, silence is eloquence. We often don't realize the impact that our words can have on other people. We can encourage people. What does it mean to encourage? It means to fill somebody with courage. And as we saw earlier, courage is what? It's just giving them the moral or mental strength to be able to move forward in spite of fear, danger, difficulty. So all that Caleb was trying to do here was to enable the people to move forward following God in spite of these other comments there. We'll come to this again later, but I just want to point out what's interesting. Caleb here, who was saying, hey, we can go in and take this place. 40 years later, when they ultimately did enter in here, Caleb was the one who, in his old age, drove those giants out of the city. He said, hey, I want to see this firsthand. Give me the giants. I want them. And I think that's a great step of faith. We don't know if he was afraid. We don't know if he even recognized how it was, but he trusted God. God had promised that he would deliver the land, and Caleb wanted to see it up close, personal, firsthand. But Caleb's encouragement didn't prevail. Verse 31, the men that went up with him said, "We be not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we." And they brought up an evil report of the land which they had searched unto the children of Israel, saying, "The land through which we have gone to search it is a land that eateth up the inhabitants thereof. And all the people that we saw in it are men of a great stature." So we went from being a land of milk and honey to now, as they're exaggerating, a land that eats up the people. And we went from having strong people, and oh, by the way, there's a few giants, to now they're all of great stature. And there we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants, and we were on our own sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight. These unfaithful spies, the 10 who were unwilling to follow God's command, who were unwilling to believe and unwilling to step out in faith, they had so convinced themselves of their weakness that they now felt like grasshoppers. And worse yet, they felt that the Canaanites also regarded them as grasshoppers. We know from other accounts, for example, when they ultimately entered Jericho, we know that many of these godless people had a horrible fear of the Israelites. God had placed within them a fear, and all it took was for the Israelites to step forward, and these people would have fled. Well, unfortunately, just as encouragement can uplift others, discouragement is contagious. We see in chapter 14, all the congregation lifted up their voice and cried, and the people wept that night. The people were listening to this talk of discouragement. They were listening to these naysayers saying it can't be done. In verse 2, they murmured against Moses and against Aaron, and the whole congregation said unto them, "Would God that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would God we had died in this wilderness?" What happened to those people who uttered that? Every single one of them died in the wilderness. That should be a real caution to us. We need to be very careful what we ask for. If we despair and are, in effect, bringing curses upon ourselves, we should not be surprised if we receive what we're asking for. In verse 4, they said to one another, "Let us make a captain, and let us return into Egypt." There are times where in the church we may face difficulty. We might encounter difficult relationships. People naturally can be difficult. Somebody might hurt us. We might have a sin that has challenged us for years that has been difficult to overcome. But the last thing that we should ever do is do what these people said, "Let us return into Egypt." Our bondage to sin is a type of Egypt, and God's freeing us from sin is a deliverance into the promised land. The last thing we ever want to do is give up on that journey and return to Egypt, giving up the good that God has for us. Now, Caleb and Joshua, in spite of the murmuring, in spite of the crying, in spite of these people saying, "Oh man, we've got to go back to Egypt," they still didn't give up. In chapter 14, verses 6 to 9, Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephunneh, which were of them that searched the land, rent their clothes. And they spake unto all the company of the children of Israel, saying, "The land which we passed through to search it is an exceeding good land. If the Lord delight in us, then he will bring us into his land and give it us, a land which floweth with milk and honey. Only rebel not ye against the Lord, neither fear ye the people of the land, for they are bread for us. Their defense is departed from them, and the Lord is with us. Fear them not." These men understood that with God, all things are possible. But you know what? The seeds of discontent, the seeds of disbelief had already been sown by these other faithless spies. And the people, here again, verse 10, "But all the congregation bade stone them with stones." There weren't even a few who were willing to turn and do what was right. The entire congregation had been led astray. And I mean, this could be another good lesson for us. Sometimes doing what's right is going to be extremely unpopular, even amongst those who should be our closest friends and our closest family. Now, I'm not going to go through the entire chapter 14 here of Numbers, but as we continue through there, and I would encourage you to read that on your own later today, we see that God sent a plague on those 10 faithless spies that killed them right in front of the congregation. The congregation saw the immediate results of faithlessness and disbelief. We saw God pronounce a curse where he said, anyone 20 years of age or older will not enter this promised land. He said, why don't you just let us die in the wilderness? Fine, you can have what you've asked for. You will die in the wilderness. And we'll see that ultimately they turned, and when God was no longer with them, decided that they would take the land by force, resulting in a very, very bad defeating battle. What we see as we read this is that the Israelites were at the edge of the promised land, poised to receive the blessings and the treasures that lay in the land of Canaan. When the spies returned, they reported it was just as wonderful as God had promised. But they said it's a mixed blessing. There's hardships there as well. There's obstacles, powerful people, fortified cities, and even giants. Their observations, the negative observations, ultimately led to a negative interpretation. First of all, they concluded, we can't attack these people. Had God asked them to attack them? Not yet. He had just said, go and explore and see what I'm going to give you. And then those negative interpretations led to an exaggeration. All the people are giants. And that ultimately led to paralyzation, where they said, let's just forget the whole thing and go back to Egypt. But Canaan in the Old Testament is a type of the kingdom of God and the rest and the peace that is found in God's presence. The promise of God's kingdom is given to each and every one of us. But how often do we get right up to the edge of God's peace? We're looking at the fruit of his rest only to back away because of some giant that's there. How many will come right up to the edge of salvation, get a glimpse of the joys that others express, feel the conviction of the Spirit in their hearts, but then pull away because the giant of the world calls them? How many come up to the edge of walking in total obedience to God? They see the blessings of a consecrated life and the rewards of servanthood. They desire to be committed to a life with Christ, but ultimately decide that the cost is too high or the time too demanding. You see, what's interesting is that as we look at the example of the children of Israel in Numbers 13, it wasn't the giants that made them grumble and complain. Similarly, it's not the obstacles in our own Christian life that keep us from a fulfilling walk with Christ. It's the giants in our hearts. It's not the external giants, it's the giants in our hearts. Giants of unbelief, giants of fear, giants of complacency that ultimately keep us from enjoying God's peace and presence. The first giant that we face is unbelief. Hebrews 3:19, when speaking about the Israelites in this circumstance, says that they could not enter in because of unbelief. It wasn't their complaining that prevented them from entering in. That was merely a byproduct of their unbelief. It was their unbelief that prevented them from entering in. When you think about it, God just said, go and explore the land. He didn't say go and determine if it's the right place. God had already determined it was the right place. In effect, what the Israelites were doing was looking a gift horse in the mouth. God had said, this is your land. This is your gift. Rather than taking it and accepting it and being thankful for it, they were looking for things that they deemed wrong with it. And their past experience should have already led them to understand that this shouldn't be a problem for God. He had already delivered them from slavery in Egypt. He'd fed them with manna, giving them manna 6 days a week, a double portion on Friday to carry them through Sabbath. He'd gone before them as a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. He had parted the Red Sea. I mean, you'd think that these guys would be able to get it. But you know what? We similarly can base our belief not only on Scripture, but also on our experiences with God. God's faithful in taking care of us. Little ways, big ways, He's faithful. And yet, sometimes when we run up against those challenges, do we go back to where God has been faithful and recount those and recall those and encourage one another with those? Or do we fall into the grumbling and the complaining and the disbelief? You know, giants are there to test our trust. Let's take a look at James. Right after Hebrews in the New Testament, towards the end there, James chapter 1, verses 2 to 4, says, "My brethren, count it all joy when ye fall into diverse temptations, knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience. But let patience have her perfect work, that ye may be perfect and entire, wanting nothing." Another version says this, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers, when you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. Perseverance must finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." You know, what God is teaching us is that our faith does not grow in comfortable surroundings. And a matter of fact, if things are too easy for us, it doesn't take any faith at all. I don't know if you've noticed in your own life and also in the times of the Bible stories, when God's getting ready to do something wonderful, He typically begins with a difficulty. And when He's getting ready to do something really amazing, He begins with an impossibility. And that's the way we need to approach things in life. When we encounter difficulties, things that are bigger than us, things that we don't have the solution for, things that we believe there's no way out, if anything, we should prepare ourselves to be amazed. How is God going to work this out? And when we stand back and through prayer and through faith and trust in God, we can see Him work and see how He will deliver. Let's remember that. The second giant we face is the giant of fear. Now remember, as we talked earlier, courage entails moving forward in spite of fear. So fear, just because we're afraid of something, doesn't mean we can't move forward or that we shouldn't move forward. It'd be ideal not to be afraid, and many times the Bible says, "Fear not." But even if there's fear, we can still move forward. You know, David, we think about courageous David slaying the lion, slaying the bear, slaying Goliath, being the mighty warrior. Psalm 56, verse 3 says, "What time I am afraid, I will trust in thee." David had fear. But he learned that when he was afraid, instead of letting the fear stop him, he trusted in God and moved forward in courage. You know, doctors have identified over 700 kinds of phobias or fears. And when you look at the whole group of fears that are out there, it's just amazing to see. Palatophobia is fear of bald people. Chaetophobia is fear of hairy people. Thalassophobia is fear of being seated. Stabisbasophobia is fear of standing. Now you see, what one person's fear is another person's delight. There's ophthalmophobia, which is fear of being stared at. There's aphasagoraphobia, which is fear of being ignored. Now, I don't know if I'd rather be ignored or stared at, but you know, when we look at fears, there's a whole variety. And you know, one of my favorite here is arachibutyrophobia, which is fear of peanut butter sticking to the roof of your mouth. Now, that's not a fear I have. It makes my mouth water just talking about peanut butter. But when we look at fear, God doesn't want us to have fear. He wants to deliver us from fear. He wants us to trust in Him. And, you know, there's thanatophobia, which is fear of death. And what's most amazing, the fear that is the greatest fear, at least for North Americans in the United States, even greater than the fear of death, is glossophobia, the fear of speaking before a group. You know, God, He doesn't give us our fears. He wants us to be delivered from these, and really the only thing we should fear is God. Romans 8:15, in Romans 8:15, Paul referred to unhealthy fears as bondage. "For you did not receive the spirit of bondage again to fear, but you received the spirit of adoption, by whom we cry out, Abba, Father. So many times we have fears that are just completely irrational. These children of Israel were fearful of cities and big people and things that were so big it made them feel like they were grasshoppers. Well, look at one of the fears that's common in our society, fear of sharks. If anything, sharks need to be afraid of us. Approximately 100 million sharks are killed every year, primarily for soup, medicine, or just entangled in fishing nets. But in California, there's only one shark attack for every 1 million surfing days. So, who should be afraid here, the sharks or the people? You are 30 times more likely to be killed by lightning than by a shark. You are more likely to be killed by poorly wired Christmas tree lights than by sharks. And as we all know, dogs, man's best friend, bite many thousands more people than sharks do. Yet sharks are something that many people are afraid of, even if they're not anywhere near water. For the Israelites, the fear of giants and fortified cities outweighed the blessing of the fruit they saw. They acknowledged the wonderful land, they acknowledged the wonderful things that were there, but they had that word, but, nevertheless. And the problem here was that they were focusing on the obstacles rather than focusing on the blessings and God's promise of deliverance. The element that contributes the most to fear in our Christian walk is that we measure obstacles and challenges against our own strength. That's exactly what the Israelites were doing. They were looking at their own strength. They were looking at their own resources rather than focusing on God's power and his resources. The Israelites saw themselves as grasshoppers in the eyes of the giants, where what they should have done is seen the giants as grasshoppers in the eyes of God. David in Psalm 27, verse 1 said, "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" He understood that as long as he ran to God, there was no need for fear of anyone. So the important question is not how big is the problem. It's not how big am I. The important question is how big is God? Paul wrote to a discouraged Timothy in 2 Timothy 1:7. He said, "God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind." Let's remember that. When we encounter something that causes us fear, that's not from God. Let's trust in God and let's accept his solutions to whatever that may be. The third giant we face is the giant of comfort and complacency. Some of the giants show up and just tell us that we're fine where we are. It's not so bad here. And that's kind of what some of the Israelites had come to the conclusion. Well, we don't need to go into the promised land. Let's stay in the wilderness, or maybe even go back to Egypt. Doesn't that sometimes happen in our Christian walk? What fear and unbelief won't do, sometimes comfort and complacency will make up. Sometimes mediocrity seems just fine. We aspire to a closer walk with Christ, but when we realize the personal sacrifice it's going to take, maybe the hobby we need to give up, maybe the entertainment that we need to set aside, maybe the time commitments that it will entail, mediocrity doesn't seem so bad after all. The fruit is bigger than life. The benefits are great, but it's a pretty big giant. The land flows with milk and honey, but the conjunction that will often kill a zealous Christian life is but. I'd be more obedient, but. I'd get more involved with the church, but. I would tithe regularly, but. I would keep the Sabbath holy, but. God, I'll go wherever you're leading me, but. Most of the time, when God is really working in our lives, he's working outside of our comfort zones. He's going to challenge us to go beyond our comfort zone. If you think about it, Paul was a Pharisee. He was highly educated, and probably he was best qualified to preach to the Jews. But where did God send him? Sent him to the Gentiles, not to his own people. He pushed Paul and stretched Paul to the limit. There were times where Paul even seemed to despair of life itself, but Paul continued to grow and to push for the finish line. Think about some of the other giants that we might encounter. What about the giants of raising our children to be godly young people? Let's look at a couple of verses. Romans 16:19. Romans 16:19. For your obedience is come abroad unto all men. I'm glad, therefore, on your behalf. But yet I would have you wise unto that which is good, and simple concerning evil. The concept of being wise unto things that are good and simple concerning evil is being rejected by the world, in case you haven't noticed. They're saying you can't shelter children, you can't do this. You know what? God would have us being simple concerning evil. We don't have to wallow in the trash to know that it stinks. We may try to raise our children in a godly way, but expect criticism. Expect that it's going to be challenging. Expect it's going to be difficult. Those are giants, but those are giants worth facing. What about the giant of unforgiveness? Let's turn to Ephesians 4:31-32. Ephesians 4:31-32 says, Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice. And be ye kind one to another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God, for Christ's sake, hath forgiven you. There are times, let me step back. God's always calling us to forgiveness. There are times where we are reluctant to forgive. But God's freely giving of forgiveness to us, and we're told to forgive as he did. That can be a giant in our life. And if we are afraid of that giant, afraid of forgiving, afraid of what that will entail, that could be keeping us out of that promised land. What about Sabbath keeping? Isaiah 58:13-14. Says, If thou turn away thy foot from the Sabbath, from doing thy pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy of the Lord honorable, and shalt honor him, not doing thine own ways, nor finding thine own pleasure, nor speaking thine own words, then shalt thou delight thyself in the Lord, and I will cause thee to ride upon the high places of the earth, and feed thee with the heritage of Jacob thy father, for the mouth of the Lord hath spoken it. God has a high standard for his holy day, and he has incredible blessings for us if we'll just accept his plan rather than running with ours. That can be a giant, and that could be a giant that can keep us from that closeness with him. What about tithing? Let's turn to Malachi 3. Malachi 3, verses 8-10. Will a man rob God? Yet ye have robbed me. But ye say, Wherein have we robbed thee? In tithes and offerings. Ye are cursed with a curse, for ye have robbed me, even this whole nation. Bring ye all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be meat in mine house, and prove me now herewith, saith the Lord of hosts, if I will not open you the windows of heaven and pour you out a blessing, that there shall not be room enough to receive it. And verse 11 says, And I will rebuke the devourer for your sakes, and he shall not destroy the fruits of your ground, neither shall your vine cast her fruit before the time in the field, saith the Lord of hosts. Particularly in times of economic difficulty, this is the greatest time of recession that we've had since the Great Depression in the 30s. People might be feeling, don't have the money to pay tithe. People might even be feeling, in order to make ends meet, I need to work on Sabbath. Those are giants that are seeking to cause you to take steps rather than trusting God and stepping into that rest, trusting him with the finances, trusting him with the Sabbath that are keeping you from him. What about the giant of purity of heart? This was something that David dealt with, and I think his counsel in Psalm chapter 101 is a good one for us today. We want to protect our children, But what about our own hearts? David, writing in Psalm 101 in verse 2 and 3, he said, I will behave myself wisely in a perfect way. O when wilt thou come unto me? I will walk within my house with a perfect heart. I will set no wicked thing before mine eyes. You know, Psalm 101 verse 3 has always been a good verse to say, I will set no wicked thing before mine eyes. That's going to include not only being on the rooftop where he was observing Bathsheba, but in our more modern day terms, that's going to include the internet. That's going to include the television and the DVDs and any other entertainment that is going to plant anything in our minds that's not bringing us closer to God. But verse 2, I want to point out to you this particularly. It says, I will walk within my house with a perfect heart. You know, it's in the privacy of our own homes. How are we handling the internet? How are we handling other recreation within our own homes? Is it a way that God would have us to do? Or is that a giant that's keeping us out of the promised land of what God has for us? You know, in the story in Numbers 13, Joshua and Caleb risked being singled out and outnumbered by the rest, yet they still stood boldly and said, we are well able. Let's go up and take the land. Of the entire group of 12, only these two were the ones who entered the promised land. And it was only because they trusted God and were willing to risk the obstacles for the blessings. 10 of the 12 spies who went out to explore the promised land forgot God's promises. They forgot his works, they forgot his faithfulness, they forgot his provision. All they could see were giants. They took their eyes off the solution, off what they knew to be true, and instead they dwelt on the problem. You know, where challenges were once perceived as opportunities to demonstrate our faith and trust in God's provision, I'm afraid that sometimes we now only see insurmountable obstacles. I would encourage you, let's get back. When we see a challenge, let's say, hey, this is going to be exciting. This is an opportunity to see how God's going to work. You know, for the Israelites, 40 days of testing, tasting, and exploring ultimately resulted in 40 years of aimless wandering because the giants were too formidable. The question I want to ask you today is, will you be one of the 2 or will you be one of the 10? Will you reap the blessings of God's rest or will you waste them by wandering in the wilderness? The exploration is over. The reports are in. How will you cast your vote? I ask you to bow your heads with prayer, please. Dear Father in heaven, Lord, we thank you for your providence. We thank you for your love. Thank you for the examples in the Bible that show us the mistakes of people that have gone before. And we just pray, Lord, that we could avoid those mistakes, that we would be willing to trust you. Help us, instead of feeling as grasshoppers, to realize that in comparison to you, all the problems that we might encounter are merely grasshoppers. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.